Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Political Hitman. I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman here on Israel News Talk Radio. Thank you so much for joining me. I do appreciate you being here. And I invite you to join me in the chat room by going to IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com and clicking on that button on the top of the page that says chat room. I will be in the chat room the entire show, and the chat room is always interesting. The talk in the chat room is always fascinating on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. You can also call in because the show is live. In North America, the number is 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 02-6500-151. If you didn't get those numbers, that's fine. They are on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. So Israel signed a deal with the United Arab Emirates. They signed a cooperation deal with the United Arab Emirates. I think some of us may have heard this over the course of the week. Mainstream media seems to have ignored this story, which is probably the largest Middle East story to happen in the last century or so. Mainstream media has ignored it simply because part of it was orchestrated by the Donald Trump administration. The U.S. president orchestrated part of it, or at least his administration orchestrated part of it. And in an election year, the Trump-hating media does not necessarily want to give President Trump the kudos he deserves for his role in this deal. Interestingly, I've heard a lot of different things, a lot of different conspiracy theories, a lot of different reasons why this deal is no good, mostly coming from the American Jewish community. Israelis seem optimistic about this. The American Jews seem a little pessimistic and a little upset about this. I want to investigate all this, and Foreign Policy Magazine published an interesting article about this. I want to share the article with you, too, because I think it's interesting to look at different perspectives on this deal and try to analyze a little bit on how this deal is going to change the dynamic of the Middle East, change the dynamic of how Israel's viewed in the world, especially in the Middle East, and also change the dynamic on how Israel deals with the Palestinian Authority. We'll do that when we come back. This is Political Hitman on Israel News Talk Radio.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Political Hitman. I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman here on Israel News Talk Radio. You could join me in the chat room by going to IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com and clicking on that big button right there on the top of the page that says Listen Live Chat Room. Chat room is open the entire show, and I would love to be with you in the chat room, to join you in conversation in the chat room. But you know what's even better than the chat room is joining me conversation live on the air. The numbers to call into the show are found on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. You're just wondering, you want to know what those numbers are? I'll give them to you right now. The number in North America is 301-768-4841. And in Israel, the number is 02-6500-0015. Hitman Show on Israel News Talk Radio. So let me tell you, there's a huge agreement signed between the United Arab Emirates and Israel this week. A huge agreement signed. It is probably the largest agreement, the best and the largest agreement signed between Israel and anyone since the foundation of the State of Israel. Now, you could say that signing the peace agreement with Egypt was bigger than this, maybe. But this is a pretty big one. And it has been underreported by everyone. Everyone has underreported it. All mainstream news media in the United States, in North America, has underreported this whole thing. And the reason they have done that is they don't want to give the impression that this peace deal was signed and was orchestrated by the Trump administration. They hate Trump. And so if Trump did something good, Trump could cure cancer, and they would find some reason to find fault in that. Now, some of the leading people who are not so happy that this deal happened are Jews in North America. Now, we speak about North American Jews a lot on this show, and the reason we do that is because the North American Jewish community is self-destructing. It is in the process of imploding. And unfortunately, I find it fascinating to watch this implosion of the North American Jewish community. I find it fascinating to watch them eating themselves and the community consuming themselves. It's a sad, fascinating phenomenon that we survived thousands of years of persecution, thousands of years of slavery, thousands of years of being beaten down, only to be living in a free country and self-imploding and killing ourselves and destroying ourselves without any outside influence. I find it fascinating. And that's why I focus so much on it. I know I get a lot of emails asking me why you focus so much on the American community. And I focus on it because it is a very sad phenomenon happening in the world. Now, this sad phenomenon has turned their eyes to this deal signed by the United Arab Emirates and Israel. They've turned their eyes there because the Donald Trump administration has orchestrated this thing, and so they naturally have to be against it because they cannot support Trump, and Trump can never do anything that's good. So naturally, they're against it. And so we've been seeing a lot of different things. I had a conversation with one of the heads of one of the major Jewish anti-defamation leagues, but it's not the anti-defamation league. It's another one of them. One of these anti-racist groups that are run by the Jewish community. I had a conversation with the head of that group today, and the head of that group tells me, and he was clear on it. He tells me that he is strictly opposed to this because this is a ploy by Donald Trump and Jared Kushner to buy land in the Gulf states, in the Gulf Arab states, to expand their personal empire. This has nothing to do with Israel, he tells me. This is solely because they want to expand their personal empire and build up their fortunes in the Gulf. The kind of a verbal and intellectual aerobics that are happening. That this was done solely for Trump to be able to benefit Trump. Now, it may be true, and it probably is, that the Trump administration did this to try to cement some kind of legacy for Donald Trump. If he doesn't win the election, he wants his presidency to be known for something more than being constantly attacked by the Democratic Party and an impeachment, which really wasn't real. It was a real impeachment, but it wasn't based on any fact. So he wants his legacy to be a little more than that. So achieving the state of Israel, every president has like building a peace agreement in the Middle East, and so I think that this is part of why this has happened. But this isn't necessarily all Trump. This has been in the works for a long time. This peace accord. I'm calling it a peace accord. I know it's not really a peace accord, so don't rip me apart on semantics. I understand it's not a peace accord. It's just much easier to refer to it as a peace accord because essentially Israel's been at war with all these countries, and now they're not. So not at war with the United Arab Emirates, even though it's not an official peace accord, It really is a de facto peace accord. So we'll just call it. I know it's a statement of understanding. It's normalizing diplomatic relations. So we'll just call it peace accord because that's generally what we call these kind of agreements in the Middle East. Anytime they happen, this is generally what they're called. So here we are, the United Arab Emirates and Israel exchanging diplomats. The prime minister is coming back and forth, the king and the prime minister, or whatever runs the United Arab Emirates, and the prime minister of Israel, the Mossad going to the UAE. It's all very exciting, all very interesting, and all extremely fascinating. Will this lead to peace in Israel? Will this lead to Israel's security and Israel living without the fear of their civilians being killed by terrorism? Well, maybe. We know that a couple of months ago, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, got up and said that he was nullifying all agreements that the Palestinian Authority ever made with Israel. So that dates all the way back to the Oslo Agreement, when the Palestinian Authority was created, when Yasser Arafat was basically resurrected from the dead and brought back, from the political dead at least, and brought back in order to oust Hamas, who were the democratically elected government of the Arabs living in the Arab territories. So they voted in Hamas. America and Israel didn't like Hamas, so they ousted Hamas and they shoved them into Gaza, and they installed the Palestinian Authority. They created the Palestinian Authority with the Oslo Accords. And the Palestinian Authority, I mean, the PLO was pretty dead. They lost the election. They were finished, and they were pretty much resurrected by Israel and the United States. So you'd figure that a guy like Mahmoud Abbas, who lived through all this, would actually be grateful to Israel and the Americans for making his group relevant. But alas, he wasn't. And so a couple of months ago, he announced that they were nullifying, that the Palestinian Authority was nullifying all agreements made by the Palestinian Authority with Israel, dating all the way back to the Oslo Accords. So essentially, with this United Arab Emirates deal, and if other countries, and we hear that there's a whole lineup of countries that want to sign deals with Israel, if other countries start signing deals with Israel, where does that leave the Palestinian Authority? It basically leaves them in the dustbin of history. So if they start up and they start committing terrorism against the Israelis, then there's many other Arab states that are now allies of Israel that will have to stand up and condemn them, states that used to back them. Now, nobody is thinking that Mahmoud Abbas is a stupid man. Nobody is thinking that the committee that Abbas has, the council that Abbas that the PLO has that makes these kind of decisions are stupid people. Nobody's dreaming that these people are living in La La Land. They must realize this. So what are they going to do? And this is the next step after normalizing relations with the United Arab Emirates, and then probably a lot of other countries are going to normalize the relations with Israel, and the Middle East might become the Riviera of the world. It might become the new Riviera of the world. I mean, the old Riviera is in France, and nobody wants to go there. So maybe the Middle East will become the new Riviera of the world. Maybe economic trade will help increase prosperity in the entire region and make life better for everybody there. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? And this is the first step towards that, hopefully. I have to be optimistic about that. We'll see where it goes, because we all know that agreements in the Middle East sometimes last, but don't generally always last. So we'll have to see where this one goes. And we'll have to see what happens to the group, the PLO, that was created to be the disturbers and the disruptors in Israel. What happens to this group now that their mandate and their raison d'etre is finished? I'm not sure. We have to see how this plays out. But for American and North American Jews, this is essentially the end of the world. Since they stood behind the PLO and they stood behind Hamas, many of them, and they supported the plight of the people who call themselves the Palestinians. We have to see where this goes. When I come back, I want to share with you some I want to share with you an article from Foreign Policy Magazine, and I want you to call in. You feel free to call in. The numbers are on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I'm Howie Silverberg. This is Political Hitman. We'll be right back.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image, it's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
2 new shows on Israel News Talk Radio.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Political Hitman. I'm Howie Silverberg, your political hitman here on Israel News Talk Radio. Welcome back to the program. You could join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. You could also call in. Numbers to call 301-768-4841 in North America. In Israel, the number is 02-6500-151. Feel free to join me in the chat room once again on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, where the conversation has already started. And the conversation is always interesting in the chat room. It's always something interesting going on. So please feel free to join me in the chat room. So Israel signed a deal with the United Arab Emirates to normalize relationships, to exchange ambassadors, and to become a normal country between the two countries. And I think it's great news. I think it's huge news that has not been covered by most of North America's media, not been covered by most of the world's media, essentially because they hate Donald Trump and they don't want it to look good for Donald Trump right before an election. The American election is coming up in November, and this is awfully close to the election, and they don't want to give Donald Trump the credit for doing something good in the Middle East. And I don't know, I just lost that word, but that word just escaped me. So they didn't want Donald Trump to have the credit of doing something great in the Middle East. Now, Foreign Policy Magazine came up with an article that's quite different. It has a different perspective, and it kind of negates Donald Trump's role in this and the Trump administration's role in this. So I think it's interesting. let me share with you at least part of this article. So this is from Foreign Policy Magazine. It was published on the 15th of August, so that was just 4 days ago. It says the normalization pact between the United Arab Emirates and Israel that surprised the world is the fruit of almost 20 years of covert ties between the two tiny Middle Eastern powers and could ultimately be traced back to the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. Because the Saudi hijackers used Dubai as a key point to transfer funds, the Emirates quickly latched onto the Israelis to develop the cybersecurity software that would help the UAE rescue and rebuild its credibility as the Middle Eastern's premier financial center. 9/11 was the big wake-up call that made it clear that the UAE needed to have the best technology, and that presented an opportunity for the Israelis, said Graham Nuzabeh, founder of the London-based Cornerstone Global Associates and a veteran advisor to companies in the region. Now, born out of necessity, the two countries' first dealings blossomed into an unusually broad relationship. Over the past 2 decades, business relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel have spread from computer surveillance and airport security into shipping, desalinization, agricultural technology, real estate, and tourism. Most prominent in the recent months has been the United Arab Emirates' interest in supporting and gaining access to Israel's research into a vaccine and treatment for COVID-19. While the common threat from Iran and the Emirates' aspirations to a bigger regional role, the Palestinian issue and pressure from Washington all played a role in the peace deal. It is these business and financial relations and the predominance of Israeli civilian defense and intelligence technology that ultimately led the groundwork for any deal. This is also where the UAE has the most to gain. And so the article continues explaining how the UAE is going to gain by having relationships with Israel, by having these kind of dealings with Israel. And so and so I find it interesting that that the UAE sees something that is apparent, that has been there from day one, something that no other Arab country, or at least they were willfully blind to. The UAE sees that Israel is a leader in the world in technology, a leader in the world in medical research, a leader in the world in agriculture and turning a desert into a garden. And the UAE says, hey, that kind of technology, that kind of innovation, that kind of work can actually help us. So why don't we use it? Why don't we trade with this country and be able to benefit from the technological advances, from the agricultural advances, from all the advances that Israel has to offer, the medical advances. I mean, it seems like a normal business kind of decision, and countries are supposed to be run like businesses. So making these kind of decisions should be second nature for countries. And yet Israel's had a hard time making these kind of deals with other Arab countries. Other Arab countries that are living in sand and living in mud huts aren't making deals with Israel. Other Arab countries that have problems with water because they can't desalinize, or are having issues with food because they can't grow food in their countries, are having problems and don't want to deal with Israel over petty politics. So this all dates back, of course. This all dates back to the founding of the State of Israel and the fact that in 1964 the Arab League decided that they had to destroy Israel. They couldn't do it militarily, so they had to destroy Israel from the inside. So they created the Palestinian Liberation Organization and essentially created the Palestinian people in order to destroy Israel from the inside out. So they created a rebel group called the Palestinians, and they still exist today. Even though they've removed themselves from the conversation, they still exist today. But they were created in 1964. And since the creation, since the world, the Arab world decided that Israel had to be destroyed, and that was for religious reasons, not even for political reasons. Because Israel's built on land that used to be owned by a caliphate. And according to Islam, any land that was controlled by a caliphate is wholly Islamic land forever. And any government that's not Islamic, that runs land, that controls land in land that used to be a caliphate, must be destroyed and the people must be killed because they're infidels. So this is a part of Islam that has ruled the region for a century at least, more than a century, but at least in the most of a century that Israel's been alive, this has been the hindrance block between Israel and the Arabs. This has been the major sticking point between Israel and the Arabs. Now, nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody talks about this Islamic problem, this religious problem. Everyone says, this is a geopolitical war. This is a war about land. This is a war about Israel, oppression. This is a war about occupation. It has nothing to do with oppression. It has nothing to do with occupation. This is a religious war. It's been a religious war from day one, and it will be a religious war until the Islamic countries decide that their economic prosperity and the survival of their people is more important than an obscure Islamic law. That running a country is more than a theology. It's more than running by Islamic law. Running a country has a lot more tentacles, and sometimes the friend of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sometimes a common interest, a common goal. And in this case, the common goal is the advancement of technology and the advancement of a country and the gaining of more prominence in a situation that the United Arab Emirates is looking to do. Sometimes that trumps, that trumps the religious objection to the establishment of the State of Israel. So until the Arabs are able to get over their religious objection to Israel, there won't be peace there. So there can be an understanding. Israel could sign peace agreements and sign all these kinds of deals with all these Arab countries in the region. But until the Arabs decide that Israel is there and Israel's not going anywhere and Israel's legitimate, until that decision is made, there will always be strife and war in the Middle East, unfortunately. And it's unfortunately it's an undeniable fact. So when we know that at Y River, when Yasser Arafat was offered everything, 98% of what they considered occupied territories, capital of Jerusalem, he was offered everything by Israel, and he turned around and walked away when Israel said the only condition we have is that after you take everything, you have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. He had to walk away because he could not do that, because that would really mess up his relationship with his Muslim friends, with the other Arab countries. They would not support him because that would be a violation of Islam. So we have to understand that geopolitics is a lot more than just land. I give you land, you give me land. We have trade. We're happy together. There's a lot more involved there, and people don't want to talk about religion because it's a tough topic to talk about. People are afraid to talk about religion because they're afraid of being called racist. They're afraid of saying something wrong and then getting the mob after them. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people are afraid to talk about religion. I'm not afraid to talk about it. This is what it is. This is the truth of the matter, and I'm not afraid to express the truth. Now, you could disagree with me, and you could call in. Number to call, North America, 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 0265001151. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to talk to you about this. Do you think that this deal will actually generate peace in the Middle East? Do you think that more Arab countries are going to sign deals with Israel? Do you think that Israel is finally going to be allowed to live in peace? I want to hear what you have to say. Once again, give me a call. In North America, the number to call is 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 0265001151. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who agree with me. I know a lot of people out there who agree with me who don't want to talk about it. I know. I know you don't want to talk about it. You're afraid to talk about it. But the fear should not exist when you are listening to Israel News Talk Radio. Here, we will, especially on this show, I allow you to talk about anything. So give me a call. The numbers are at the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Also, join me in the chat room. The conversation in the chat room is rolling. Let's keep going. Right there on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. My name is Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Political Hitman.
I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, here on Israel News Talk Radio. Feel free to join me in conversation right here on the air on Israel News Talk Radio. Number to call, 301-768-4841 in North America. In Israel, the number is 02-650-0151. Of course, you could join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And the numbers are on the top of the page there, too. So the United Arab Emirates, Israel signed agreement, and we just have to wait and see how this is going to play itself out in the Middle East. The Democratic Party of the United States of America is now holding their national convention. They have nominated Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be their running mates to run for president and vice president for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has made it clear, by the way, that they do not support this peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. They do not support it at all, and we know that North American Jews. Approximately 80% of North American Jews vote for the Democrats every election. So we know that this is happening. We know that the Jews of North America are actually voting for the United States of America to not support the state of Israel. So when I say that North American Jewry is imploding, this is what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying that in order to be a good Jew, you have to support Israel. That's not what I'm saying at all. But in order to be a good Jew, you don't have to support Israel, but you don't have to work towards Israel's destruction either. You could be indifferent to Israel and still be a good Jew, but when you work against Israel, when you support parties that are actively against the state of Israel, when you support policies that actively hurt the state of Israel, when you stand with the Arabs who want to kill Jews, who are very clear about wanting to kill Jews, then that is a clear indication that the Jewish community, at least a good portion of the Jewish community in the United States, is falling apart and is imploding. I know we spoke about this a little bit, and I said I don't really care, but when you look back at Seth Rogen and his comments, he went to a Jewish school. He went to Jewish day school. He went to a Jewish day camp. And then he came out and said, look, they lied to me about Israel. I didn't know that there were people living in the land when Israel became a country, and Israel oppressed those people. And he went on, just with basically the general basic screed from the BLM movement. Not the BLM, yeah, the boycott divestment movement. Sorry, BDS. There's too many acronyms these days. The BDS movement. When he basically went on a screed with the BDS movement. And he did it on a podcast with a Jewish born comedian who does nothing but disparage Judaism. So it's interesting, and Rogan did this at the same week that his new movie called An American Pickle came out. Now, I watched the movie. American Pickle. I thought it was interesting. I thought it would be interesting to watch. And I was waiting. Many people warned me, don't watch this movie. We saw the first 5 minutes of it. It was disgusting. And I watched the first 5 minutes of this movie. In fact, I watched the entire movie. And the story was basically about a religious Jew who got stuck in a pickle jar. And he was in pickle brine for 100 years. And then he was released from his pickle jail. He was still alive somehow, pickled, I guess. And he started off in the 1800s in the early 1900s in New York City. And then now he was in 2020 in New York City, and he went to find his great-grandson, who was also played by the same character, played by the same actor, who was a completely assimilated Jew. So he was a religious Jew, he was an assimilated Jew, but they didn't go over Jewish history. It was basically a family relationship thing, and it was kind of dumb, to be honest. But it wasn't disgusting, it wasn't horrible. But it didn't touch the subject of Israel. It would have been interesting had his character actually talked about the state of Israel and told the 100-year-old character about the Holocaust, about Israel. I mean, a little bit of Jewish history, but unfortunately, and we have to understand this, and this was reflective in the movie, and this is the only reason I'm talking about it. It was reflective in the movie. Rogan actually depicted modern-day Jews accurately. He couldn't talk to his great-grandfather or his grandfather. I don't remember if it was grandfather or great-grandfather. I think it was grandfather. I don't remember. He couldn't talk to the 100-year-old, the guy who was in pickle brine for 100 years. He couldn't talk to him about the Holocaust. He couldn't talk to him about the state of Israel and the founding of the state of Israel, because he didn't know anything about it. And this is where reality and fiction kind of clash. And they clashed and they joined together. When Rogan made the statement on Mark Maron's podcast that he was lied to as a kid about the state of Israel, probably relatively true. We know that Jewish education, when it comes to teaching Zionism, is lacking in North America. So it's probably true that he was lied to, not in the ways he described it, but lied to in many other ways. They are not taught. Jews in the United States today are not taught about Jewish history. They're not taught. I mean, sure, they're taught about the Holocaust a little bit, maybe in grade 11, grade 12, but they're not taught really about the actual history of the founding of the State of Israel. They're not taught about Zionism and how Zionism existed way before the establishment of the State of Israel. They're not taught that. I remember when I took over teaching Zionism in a school, Israel advocacy in a high school. Many of the students asked me in the first class. I asked them, "What do you know about Zionism? What do you know about Israel?" Many of the students answered me, "Well, the State of Israel was created as a result of the Holocaust." And that was kind of a shocking answer to me because, these kids went through, and this was grade 11, so these kids went through, 5 years of high school, and then 6 years of elementary school, and they never learned that the drive for the State of Israel, that modern-day Zionism started way before the Holocaust. They never learned that the drive for the State of Israel was not a direct result of the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust didn't hurt the chances, but it wasn't a direct result of the Holocaust. That the plan for the State of Israel was in place way before Hitler started killing Jews. It's just fascinating to me that this is what they thought. It's fascinating to me that Rogan didn't broach this topic at all in his movie American Pickle, essentially because American Jews wouldn't have any clue. And that's really where the sadness comes in, and the horrific horrors. I mean, the night terrors come in when you think that there's generations of Jews that growing up that have no idea. Which brings us back to the deal Israel signed with the United Arab Emirates. So here we have a deal. It's a major deal. Many other Arab countries are now going to sign deals with Israel. Israel might be on the path to finally achieving peace in the Middle East. North American media has pretty much blackballed the story. They haven't covered it in the extent that they should have covered it, the detail that should have been covered. And North American kids, North American Jews, stand opposed for the most part. It's a sad situation. It's really a horrible situation, and there's no way to turn it. I mean, I think we've passed the point of no return. I think we've passed the idea that we could turn back time and re-educate the North American community. I don't think this is a possibility. What I think now, I think that that Jews that care about Judaism, Jews that care about Israel, Jews that want to be Jews and want the Jewish state to exist, have to either separate themselves from the woke Jews of North America, have to move to Israel, maybe. I think we're coming to that point where the only solution for North American Jews will be the removal of the Jewish population, the voluntary removal of the Jewish population from North America, and the filling up of the state of Israel. That will guarantee the existence of the state of Israel. That will guarantee that Israel will have the numbers to exist, and it will also guarantee that the assimilation plague that has killed North American Jewry won't destroy all of North American Jewry. I think it's time for North American Jews to start considering a mass exodus. I know I've said this before, and I continue to say it, but the clock is ticking. And if the clock is not answered, if the alarm goes off, it might be too late. And if it's too late, we already know what happens when it's too late. We see the violence on the streets of North America. We see the violence on the street of America. And we know that when the violence starts on the street and the chaos starts, one of the first people they come for are the Jews. History has taught us that. If we don't remember history, we're bound to repeat it. And that's really the lesson here. And we've learned from history that when chaos takes over, we have big problems. As Jews, we have big problems. So we got to wake up. North American Jews, you got to wake up. We got to look at ourselves. We got to pull up our pants. We got to understand the time is now. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next week.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.